All right, welcome back. We're back, both of us. Been a little while. The last month was a month, and it passed, and now we're in August. So we're finally getting to Silence, the great novel by Shusaku Endo, rather famous Catholic Christian Japanese novelist. Most of his books apparently have quite a bit to do with Christianity. And this book actually, you know, I've actually read this book before. I think you mentioned you had read this book before as well. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so this was a second reading for both of us, which is kind of cool. It's the first time I've read it as a practicing Catholic. The last time I read it was before I had converted and been brought into the church. And it makes quite a different impression being Christian this time versus the first time. But we can talk about that as we get to it. More about it. It really just mostly concerns the second half of the book more than the first. So before we get into it, you want to share any general thoughts you have, or any general ideas, or anything like that?
Well, I'll start by saying that there's a lot in this book that can be talked about, and I hope we cover at least most of it. A lot of interesting ideas and themes at
Mm-hmm.
play. Um, if I were to just start now, I might be jumping off prematurely, but I'll go ahead and give a preview that what I hope we can talk about early on is uh, really just start by establishing a basic definition of apostasy because it's
Mm-hmm.
very clearly one of the main ideas or questions at the center of the novel.
Absolutely.
It
Yeah.
what it means and what its significance is.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Go ahead.
But we're probably uh, I will try to give a very brief summary of what, in its basic contours, this novel is about. It is a historical novel that is set around the time that the Jesuits were evangelizing in Japan, which was in the 1500s, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Or at least that's the time period this novel covers, I think.
Yeah. This
And
book takes place in the early 17th century, 1620s, I believe, 1610s. There are a couple of dates given, actually, or later than that, 1640s. Sorry.
thank you for supplying the details.
Yeah.
The novel in particular is focused on Japan's backlash to these evangelistic efforts and the persecution that resulted, both of Japanese Christians and the Jesuits themselves. Um, and the novel is the novel follows a particular Jesuit named Sebastian Rodriguez, who comes to Japan to investigate reports that a prominent Jesuit uh, apostatized, uh, which was horrible news to everyone who heard it. Obviously, the Jesuits back home. Uh, so Father Rodriguez wants to investigate this.
And this is not just a well renowned and well respected Jesuit who apostatized, it was also Rodriguez's mentor in school. He personally knew the man.
Yes, yes. Um, so that's my very basic summary of where the how the book starts off and things progress.
Yep,
But before we get into all those details, I do want to say a little bit about the nature of apostasy.
sure.
So the way Merriam-Webster defines apostasy is an act of refusing to continue to follow or obey or recognize a religious faith. So another way of putting that is that apostasy is a renunciation or denial of what one has believed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you define apostasy that way, um, I think one thing that's important to note right from the outset is that uh, it's plain to see that, just to give one particular example, a very famous example, uh, St. Peter himself committed the sin of apostasy
Mm-hmm.
when he denied knowing Christ uh, shortly after, during the Passion narrative.
Mm-hmm. Three
And
times.
yet, yes, three times, and yet he was able to repent of this sin and remain chief of the apostles and play the enormous role that he did in preaching and spreading the gospel in the days of the early church.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that I think is very important to note before we start talking about this book in particular, is that first of all, apostasy is in fact a sin, but it's also, like virtually all sins, putting aside what is often referred to as the unforgivable sin. We're not going to talk about what that is exactly, but it's often said to exist.
Right.
It can be repented of, is my point. You're not irrevocably gone if you apostatize.
True. Yeah. In fact, this reading of the book, the second reading of the book for me, made the nuances that Endo is talking about, in at least the second half of this book, that is set up by the first half, of course, much deeper than they were the first time I read it. But we'll get to that. We'll get to the second half when we get to the second half. So, the
I,
yeah.
I would like to clarify. I don't wish at all to minimize apostasy when I say that,
Mm-hmm.
but I still think it's worth remembering as we go through how the book handles it.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing with the apostatization of the apostasy, I guess, of with spoilers, Rodriguez. This book's been out for 50 years. I think you've had ample time to read it yourself. We're going to be talking about it anyway. Is he the way that Endo puts so much emphasis on the interior world of Rodriguez during his period of crisis, I guess you could call it, his torture, although he wasn't actually like physically tortured. Um, it although apostasy is something that can be repented of, the way that he views his religion changes, or at least is made more clear as a result of his trials, and I think he ends up contorting his religion by the end of it, which is what allows him to do what he does in full sincerity without necessarily contradicting the things he thinks he believes. But we can get there in once we get there. That's don't want to put the cart before the horse. So, yeah, this book is. Before we start too much on the story, I do want to note on the style, which is really good and varied, because the book is split between, or written from the point of view of letters by Rodriguez once he arrives in Macau, and then again when he arrives in Japan, that are written under the presumption that they're probably never going to actually see the people that they're addressed to, but nonetheless he's writing these as sort of a log and taking address of the things that occurred during that period of days or weeks. So they're partly narrative letters, but they're also still written as letters, almost like diary entries. And then once he is captured, pretty much getting into the second leg of the book, or maybe third, but really kind of the second leg of the book, the tone and the style switches to very stark third person, semi-omniscient, I guess, where the narrator is left with almost an objective witness to what Rodriguez is going through. And in this period, Rodriguez, I can't think of a single time off the top of my head in which Rodriguez is referred to by name. He is always referred to as the priest during this period of the narrative. And then finally, this continues all the way through to the end of the book until the last chapter, which is both actually, because the last chapter, chapter 10, are extracts of a diary of a clerk in Nagasaki who's just sort of taking, who's hearing things around town about some things that occurred, and is also taking a log of imports and exports from Nagasaki. Is actually a really cool little. It's not really an Easter egg. It's intentionally put there to be noticed, but we'll get to that. And then after that, it switches back to this sort of stark, distanced witness of the priest as his last narrative finishes up with the priest in his now compound. So that's pretty cool. We don't usually talk about, well, you and I do, but generally speaking, people don't often make explicit note of styles of books unless they're particularly weird. And while this isn't very weird, I wouldn't consider it experimental by any means. It is still worth noting because it is a very interesting way of telling the story. Endo was thinking very multidimensionally by doing that. Anyway, cool. All right. Did you have any places you wanted to start with getting into the book, or should we just launch into like the first half and talk about that, and then talk about the second half, or go through characters, or?
We should probably start with the first half. The problem with me and this particular novel is my head's so thoroughly wrapped up in pretty much everything having to do with the climax. But that we should probably start before that. So please supply us with the proper lead-in.
Yeah, well, the first half of the book, like any book, exists to get you to the second half of the book. So we'll start there. I'll give a brief summary that I typed up actually just a few minutes ago, because I have notes here, and this time I tried to make slightly more thorough notes as I was reading it, but I didn't do that, so I ended up having to, day before the assignment, put them together. Classic. Here we go. So, as you mentioned, it begins with an investigation, a trip to Japan by a pair of priests under the interests of investigating allegations that this Father Ferriera had apostatized. What I had forgotten until I read this book, and this is actually an important note, it's sort of the Easter egg at the end, is it was actually 3 priests that went. And one of them got sick in Macau and stayed in Macau while the other 2 went ahead. And the 2 priests that went ahead, as you mentioned, is Father Sebastian Rodriguez and then Francisco Garp. And Garp, the impressions I have of both of these priests is, now, the narrative's all written and focuses on Rodriguez. Garp is there as, to some extent, sort of a foil for him at the beginning, but also a fellow traveler. They don't seem to be super close to each other, but Garp does seem to take certain things with more seriousness than Rodriguez does, especially he's both of the priests are quite harsh on the Christians around them, especially once they land in Japan, and rather famously, rather importantly, rather obviously, noticeably, is with Kichijiro, who is going to be a big topic of conversation, I expect, with regards to this book. Kichijiro is a Japanese man they meet in Macau, and they take him, they go with him, or they take him with them. I forget exactly how that arrangement worked, but he's on the same boat with them when they go to Japan. And he plays a pivotal role in getting them connected with Christians, the first couple of Christian communities they encounter in Japan. Now, Kichijiro is fairly detestable, I think you could say that without too much controversy. He is cowardly. He is bloviating when he's in a good mood. He is untrustworthy. He insists when they first meet him in Macau that he is not a Christian and that he never was a Christian. And then there's a incident on the boat over when they're caught in a bad storm and the boat's actually starting to take on some water, where one of the priests, I think it's Rodriguez, witnesses him praying Hail Marys, or something similar to it, basically doing something that only a Christian would ever do. And that sort of throws them for a loop. So they're very suspicious of him. But he also does get them connected with some of the hidden Christians in Japan, some of the Catholics there, and helps them orient themselves at the beginning, which would be about the first third of the book or so. And we can get into some of the stuff in the villages. I think the most important stuff about the things in the villages that occur is we first witness what happens to some of the Christians, well, like through Rodriguez's eyes, where before he'd simply heard about some of the tortures they were put through. There's also this idea that because there has been such a shortage of priests due to the persecutions, the Christians in the villages have turned to like create a secondary system almost, where you have trusted village elders doing the baptisms, which the lay people can do, and leading a community in prayer. But since there aren't any priests, there's no communion, there's no confession, there's no real last rites distribution or anointing of the sick, I should say. They marry people as best that they can, but obviously it's lacking the sacrament of it. So the formalized religious body being absent from these villages is being, the belief is being carried on and pulled along by the laity instead, which is kind of neat. But one of the things they also mention, which I thought was rather interesting, I'd forgotten this the first time I read it, was that because of the persecutions, people outside of the village are not trusted. So, you might have 2 or 3 villages in a region, but this sort of quasi-ecclesial faith group is isolated on a per village basis because they don't trust the other villages around them. So I thought that was an interesting detail. Of course, it's real. That's a real thing that actually happened. So anyway, and the first half of the book, I would say, effectively concludes when the 2 priests, they decide to part ways in order to better canvass the region, so that the 2 priests can act in full authority and full capacity, administering the sacraments and attending to these different communities as much as they can, while also carrying on this search for Father Ferriera, because Rodriguez and Garp actually both sort of presume that he's dead, but they just want to make sure that he did actually end up a martyr and not what the rumors posit, which is that he was an apostate. And after that happens, Rodriguez spends some time on his own. There's a very interesting passage where he almost goes and tries to become a priest for a village that he sees, but he is convinced not to by Kitajiro, who he runs into by chance at this point, or seemingly chance. I think probably chance or providential of some sort. And spends some time in Kitajiro's company, about a day or so, before Kitajiro turns him in. And once he's turned in, I think that's pretty much the second half of the book. So, yeah. Any thoughts on any of that stuff?
There is one thing I want to touch on a bit, and that has to do with the Japanese authorities' pressure that they put on the village that that Rodriguez and Garp are part of for a while.
Yeah.
So the as I remember it, the authorities are threatening to torture the entire village unless they. I think it was essentially confess that they are closet Christians, something to that effect. And something that I think is worth mentioning here before we get to the second half of the book is, let me pull up this brief excerpt here. So the way that the method that the Japanese authorities devised to have people demonstrate that they are not a Christian is to trample an image of Christ, which is known as a fumie, however you say that.
Yep.
And so that's the shorthand in this entire book for apostatizing, is to trample the fumie. And so one of the villagers says, "It's not only a matter that concerns us. If we don't trample, everyone in the village will be cross-examined. What are we to do?" And here's what Rodriguez says in response: "Trample, trample," I shouted. But immediately I realized that I had uttered words that should never have been on my lips.
Yeah.
Garp looked at me reproachfully.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to mention that now, and I'm going to want to talk about it more later, because as we established before, apostasy is a sin, and a very serious one at that, obviously. So it is just a little bit noticeable that a priest is advising Christians under his care after a fascia to deliberately commit a sin.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm going to have a lot more to say about that later, but I just wanted to mention that here since it shows up this early.
There's some key things about Rodriguez's character that show up in the first half that I should probably mention too. One of them is I had mentioned, you brought up a really good one, which is that incident. There's also when he, after they split up and Rodriguez encounters that village. I should have bookmarked this part, but I didn't for some reason. Um, oh no, I did. All right. He, he it's like he gets this vision in his head of him administering to this village and being the priest for this village and tending to their religious needs and things. Um, but it's like a fantasy, a very obvious sort of weird, self-important fantasy that goes through his head, and you start to notice, especially in the first half, but especially even more so in the second half, this idea of like, I am the one bringing the sacraments to these people because they're all relying on me. I have to be this. I have to be this great person to do this stuff, and it's not obviously phrased in the context of he doesn't consider himself to be overinflated in his self-importance by believing these things, because at the end of the day, those are good things to be doing for people, but the way that he's processing information and the way he's positioning himself with relation to other people is very much as a superior among inferiors that is going forth to help them out of the goodness of his heart, effectively. And this is also even more made clear in the first half with there's something to do with some pilgrims that I don't think they encounter but they hear about, and just also his relationship with Kichijiro, he just like utter detestation of the guy, which I guess is warranted, but it's still not. You wouldn't necessarily expect some of the things that he believes and some of the things that he has on his mind to be on the mind of a priest per se. And the only reason this is even worth noting is because at the very beginning of the book, these three priests were actually like, they weren't reprimanded, but their superiors back in Rome were basically saying this is a bad idea and you really aren't the ones that we should be sending over there. But they relented and decided to trust in these guys' tenacity, I suppose. And the result was, two of them die and one of them apostatizes. So that's that. But yeah, this is all going to be important when we get to the climax and how Endo handles that whole stuff.
I do want to say that I definitely share your assessment of Rodriguez that he absolutely overestimates himself in relation to the other people he's around, the local Japanese Christians in particular. He honestly he holds them to a lower standard, which is why a lower moral standard. I mean,
yeah,
which is in part why he outright encourages them to apostatize, but he tells himself, "Oh, I would never do that."
Yeah.
But it's okay if you do it because I can't expect as much of you.
Exactly. There's that, and then there's a scene. I thought I'd had this bookmarked, but I didn't. There's a scene after he's caught and he's in prison, and the woman, she's not a super important character in the book, but I forget her name. She shows up a couple times while he's in prison. She offhand mentions something to him about like, we're suffering these trials so that we can be rewarded in heaven. Isn't that right, Father? Or something like that. And like his response to that interiorly is like, this woman's a moron. Like, this is heaven's not just a reward you get for doing good. It's not like a place with, and it was also had to do with you paying, in heaven we won't have to pay these taxes. In heaven we won't have to suffer these indignities. And he's processing this as being like, you're such a small-minded buffoon. Heaven is so much bigger than that, so much more better than that. And how do I explain to this nincompoop what heaven really is? And
And my response to that was, she didn't say anything that was incorrect.
That's exactly it, right? Like, I mean, she's right. In heaven, you won't have to pay taxes. That's true.
God help us if there are taxes in heaven.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's those kinds of things that pop up with Rodriguez's character over and over again, and they're always usually very little things that have maybe a couple of sentences attached to them before it moves on. Everything in this book moves very, very quickly. I'd forgotten how short the book actually is. I mean, it's almost 200 pages, but you get through a lot in that time frame. So yeah, there you go. He's and that's, I think all of this is actually kind of good because you don't want to presume your priests are superhuman creatures that are unable to feel common problems like the rest of us. But I do think that it's not unreasonable to expect of them, one, deeper knowledge of the faith and a deeper profession, hopefully, of charity than the average person. And charity seems to be distinctly, ironically, lacking in Rodriguez.
If we're gonna have if we're gonna have an informal, fictitious priest ranking, we'll go ahead and start that, and we'll say that
It's a good one.
the nameless French priest is pretty well high above.
Oh yeah,
Rodriguez, I'd say.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would.
Much more aware of his own failures and shortcomings.
Yeah, perhaps neurotically so, but I think it was good for considering if these are our two options at the moment. It seems self-evident which priest was a better priest. But yeah, so well, let's go ahead and continue. So we have Rodriguez has been captured by Kichijiro. He's spent some time in prison. He's trotted around a bit. He's interrogated by I think an unnamed lower level investigator, and he is expecting to be martyred. He's basically just like, well, you've got me, so I guess you're just gonna have to kill me now. The interrogator's like, what are you talking about? No, we don't want to kill you. These he starts to learn the real nefariousness of their interrogation methods. One of them is leveraging the peasants and the laity, presumably laity. It's not always the laity. Sometimes it's just other apostates against the priest. Sometimes it's through argument, like Inoue uses argument, but really not as much as I remembered. He only actually argues with Inoue, I think, twice. And then they also they really prey on his conscience, which is devilish, which is part of the allegorical aspect of this book. So we can talk a little bit about that once we finish getting to the end of it here. I forgot to mention Inoue. For those who have not read the book, I don't think we've mentioned him before. He is this almost... he is a man who has gotten people to apostatize and has hunted Christians in Japan with such tenacity that the church knows about him outside of Japan. And the priests were explicitly warned about this figure of Inoue by their Jesuit superior in Macau before they left for the archipelago, and basically said, be careful of this dude because he's basically a demon. And that's... He kind of is. He kind of is basically a demon, but not in.
And go ahead.
Yeah, well, not like in a particularly obvious bloodthirsty way. It's just he preys on people and obviously relishes on it. Preys on driving them into madness, into rejecting the things that they presumably hold dear. And
Yes, like most demons, I will say, perhaps not all, but most, they're not there to break you in your body. They're there to break you mentally and spiritually.
exactly, yeah. And Inoue does a fantastic job doing that. He loves his job. I guess he doesn't have to work a day in his life. But anyway, so we get through that. We do eventually meet Inoue in a rather amusing and famous scene from the book. Rodriguez is dragged before another interrogator and is just asked questions about the faith and what the purpose of the faith in Japan is, and is given a mild lecture about the idea that the faith doesn't belong in Japan. And uh, Rodriguez finally kind of snaps and demands to know why their best investigator would have had him killed at this point. What are they even doing playing these games with him? And they laugh at him because the guy asking him all these questions is Inoue himself, which I thought was a good scene. And we can fast forward a little bit here because eventually he does meet with Ferriera, who, unfortunately, for Rodriguez, has not been killed as a martyr, but did in fact apostatize, and he's brought to Rodriguez is brought to Nagasaki and to a Buddhist temple there, where Ferriera is brought out in the somewhat customary Buddhist robes, led by a Buddhist monk, and Ferriera is broken, like a dog. Just an embarrassing, rather disgraceful sight for Rodriguez's sore eyes. And they talk to each other for a bit, and Ferriera sort of explains what's going to happen to him. And Ferriera was also subjected to the pit, which is, I think, anyone who's even heard of the book Silence knows what the pit is, being hung upside down, and with letting blood pour out of your head so that you don't die from the blood pooling in your brain. And he was subjected to the pit only once, but he does mention that it wasn't the torture that got him to apostatize. It was effectively his own weakness in the faith. Because Ferriera, although different from Rodriguez in quite a number of ways, still held this weakness for the Japanese around him in much the same way. He did not hold them to the same standards, and also took a little too seriously how can't you? I've certainly never been in that situation, but took a little too seriously their suffering without accord for basically what they would be receiving in exchange for that suffering. And moreover, actually, that was more Rodriguez's issue. With Ferriera, it was more that he just didn't believe God would let this happen to people, and tried to adjust his faith accordingly, and in so doing, that adjustment resulted in him apostatizing. So, very interesting conversation, too, because there's that, and the second conversation they have at the end, which is what we're closing in on, Ferriera's incessant demands, basically more to himself, to convince himself, it sounds like, that he has been useful, and in this way he will be useful, and he will be of service to the people of Japan, and even to the Christians of Japan, which is such an insane thing to say, given that he gave up the sacraments in order to write some astronomy star charts and a refutation of the faith, so-called refutation of the faith. So that brings us, I think, right up to the end. Did you want to talk about the end before, or do you want me to just continue this little short summary, or what you want to do?
I think for the sake of thoroughness, you should probably finish
Okay.
with the basic summary. It's like I said before, almost everything I want to say ties into the climax,
Yeah.
but I don't want to skip too much.
Yeah. Well, in both of our cases, we finished reading this book, I would assume, more than a month ago at this point. So the memories are still mostly fresh, but not quite as fresh as they could have been because of it's just the summer has been a summer. All right, so we get to the end, and he's been locked in a cell. At some point, Kichijiro visits him. I think this was before all this, but he visits him while he's in his cell, and talks to him outside while the guards are away or asleep or something, and asks to have his confession heard. And Rodriguez, out of sense of obvious obligation, um, uh, does so. He hears Kichijiro's confession, grants him absolution, and then Kichijiro is promptly chased out of the camp by the guards who have returned. Um, that's just a note that's worth remembering. We get to the end here, and he's put back in his cell to ruminate and stew in his own conscience, and it's a rather lengthy internal conversation with God. Maybe it's hard to explain what's going on in his mind. I think he's just going mad. And over the course of this, he can hear the snoring of the guards outside, and it's just driving him nuts because they're, how can they, how the reality of the situation is completely setting in for him. And the following morning, he's brought out of his cell in order to carry out the formalized fumie stamping. All this time, one detail I left out was all of this time, the first interrogator that he meets, the translator guy, Inoue himself, Ferreira too. At this point, when Ferreira sees him the second time to bring him to the fumie thing, all this time, all of the Japanese have wanted him to do is just formally renounce it. They don't care if he believes it inside. All they want him to do is just basically outwardly say a few words, and put his foot on top of the picture, and that's that. They'll be happy with that. They don't care if he still believes it. They say what they care about is that he's not doing this social thing, so to fulfill this, in theory, social obligation as they frame it.
They want that public denial.
Yes. Now, in Rodriguez's case, they get it. He through the course of this, it's all the way up to the last moment. He's seemingly to fight with himself and going mad over what he's supposed to be believing here and what he's supposed to be doing, until at last he sort of believes that he sees the image of our Lord there on the fumie, beseeching him to do it. He believes he sees that, and so he does it, and case closed. Inoue gets another head on his wall, and they gain another, I guess, quasi-Buddhist priest, some sort of apostate guy here. And Rodriguez ends up fulfilling the same task and job that Ferreira does. So not only does he apostatize, he also ends up being, he doesn't exactly take a wife, but he's given a wife and a compound to live in that is obviously heavily guarded. And Kichijiro ends up being one of his attendants, along with a number of others. He works for the local government near Nagasaki to determine whether objects coming in and out of the port are have some sort of Christian purpose, as well as objects that are found in and around the area, if they have some sort of Christian purpose, in order to aid authorities in cracking down even further on these communities. And the last bit of note to sort of fill out the book here, the last chapter does mention some of all this in sort of in parallax, but also mentions that there was a third priest that showed up on the island a little while after this and was immediately martyred. he showed up with some Christian things. The authorities found him almost immediately, and there was nothing they could do with him, so they just martyred him. He just was completely unwilling to even listen to what they had to say, and that was, of course, the third priest that they had left in Macau, who clearly recovered and then followed them as he said he was going to do, and he's just immediately killed. Doesn't go through any of this rigmarole. And the last part of it is the appendix was actually very interesting too, because the appendix talks about, I don't know why the appendix wasn't just part of the last chapter really, but the appendix talks about Rodriguez's the end of his life, the last part of his life, and the residence kept being something of a hotbed for Christian items being found there, but Rodriguez himself showed no outward indication whatsoever that he had reverted back to his Catholic faith in any way. I have a suspicion. I think what's going on here is I don't think he ever did revert back to his faith in any formal sense, but I do think that Kichijiro was the reason that objects kept showing up. I think Kichijiro was the guy behind that. And what's really fascinating to me is you have no idea what happened to Kichijiro. He's in this appendix. He's mentioned as being brought in for questioning at least once, alongside two other of the household, and then just let go. And the other two are subjected to further questioning. But that's the last you ever hear of Kichijiro. So that's it. That's the simple summary of the book. I've missed quite a bit, but we're going to talk about it a bit more. So there you go.
Well, thank you for that very general outline. And now we have come to the emotional climax of the novel, which is the moment where Rodriguez apostatizes finally and puts his foot down the fumier. And I want to talk about this in particular because this is like a classic ethical dilemma that Endo is presenting in this scene.
Mm-hmm.
And what's making it sharper is that, as I can't remember who it is that explains this, but essentially the situation is there are a number of Japanese Christians still in the pit. They've already apostatized,
Yep.
but they're not going to be set free until Rodriguez apostatizes.
Right.
So it's this classic horrible, contrived scenario where the person putting it to you says, if you don't do such and so, these people are going to be suffering. You're causing them to suffer.
Yeah.
So you need to make it stop by doing this thing that you really shouldn't do.
Not the people who put them in the pit. No.
Yeah. So, like I say, it's a very when I say classic moral dilemma, I really mean a very modern moral dilemma, in the sense that what is powering it is what has been termed in the literature as negative responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the idea that if someone harms someone else based on my own action or inaction, then I am responsible for that other person's suffering.
Right.
That is consequentialist in nature. And the idea of consequentialist ethical thinking is that the consequences of one's actions are the only morally relevant factor in assessing the morality of one's actions, not the actions or intentions in themselves. And the only minor wrinkle in all of that is that Orthodox Christian ethics is not consequentialist.
Mm-hmm.
Some actions are intrinsically immoral and should therefore never be performed, no matter what the consequences.
Right.
And apostasy obviously falls into that category.
Yeah.
So if you look at it all that way, this really shouldn't be a moral dilemma at all. But
No.
but it's all about how you're thinking about it, I guess. And in this novel, Rodriguez is clearly accepting this rather modern line that it's incumbent on me to prevent the suffering by committing a sin.
Yeah, and that's set up throughout the novel by his over emphasis on, I guess, a sort of humanism, really, where it's a simultaneous humanism and complete, or not complete, but a lack of charity, because he treats the Japanese that he comes across almost like, the way I would think of it is like he's built a category of these people in his head, and then he interacts with that category instead of interacting with the people themselves in front of him, even as he carries out his priestly duties for them and to them. One of the things, I don't, if this is getting off track, then go back to what you were talking about. We can revisit this, but I think this ties into the fact that we mentioned before that Rodriguez is not doesn't come across as the best priest in the world of fiction. But even as a priest, like I've now I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on priests. I just converted to the faith. About what 2018, so not super. Didn't grow up in the faith, but I've known a number of priests at this point who have come through the parish or who are thankfully still at the parish, as well as those who have just stopped in or those who were friends of people I knew who I just happened to meet. And one thing I've noticed now, I go to a traditional Latin Mass parish, but I've also attended Novus Ordo incidentally, when traveling or, just because I missed Mass in the morning because I was ill or something, but made it in the afternoon. And one of the things I've noticed with all the priests I've ever interacted with, ever heard sermons from, ever had over for dinner, had, been able to talk with at length on anything, they don't really act this way. It may be the luxury of 60 some odd years of Second Vatican Council not exactly being what people thought it was and not yielding the fruits we expected. And as a result, a reaction of a more engaged priestly class in the last 20 years or so. Maybe that's the reason. I don't know. But all of them take prayer very, very seriously and take devotions, specific devotions. They all have their own devotions that they have an interest in very seriously. And they also take the Eucharist extremely seriously. So, like I said, I'm very gracious to have been around very good, what I assume are very good priests. They seem like good priests to me. So I know that there are plenty of Catholic priests out there that perhaps don't do some of these things, or maybe not as much as others. But my point is that in this book, I found it interesting that the priest does not, like, he'll make offhand references to praying his rosary, which, even at this point in time in the 1600s was something that was, if you had that devotion, and like if you, insofar as you were carrying a rosary around with you, that was something as a priest you're probably going to do every single day without fail. And you're also going to do it as a thing that is engaged with and not just like the way somebody does their dishes. You're going to be really trying to pray sincerely on anything. And there are a few times he mentions it, but he never actually, like, you never see him really do it. And when you get to the part where it's uh, in the second half of the book, when it's no longer seeing Rodriguez through his own letters, but you're seeing him in his cell, you're seeing him subjected to the persecutions, you never see him engage in some of this behavior. The other thing I've noticed about priests I know in real life is the Mass is very, very important to them. It's something that they love too, that they actually enjoy doing it. They love doing it because for the same reason the Eucharist is so important. It is a literal face-to-face with God in a way that prayer doesn't even get to. So, and of course, Mass is also a whole bunch of prayers too. So you're doing both at the same time, an internal and an exterior, an interior and an exterior union of the soul coming to God, which is cool. And that doesn't come across in this at all because, again, the Mass is almost like, I don't think you ever even see it celebrated. Maybe it's referenced once near the beginning. No, it is referenced once in one of the villages because he mentions distributing communion. So I thought that was like just weird for a priest. It's like his priestliness is completely overshadowed by his the faculties of his priestly state of his priestness are almost totally absent from the book compared to what you would expect from a priest. And you can compare this to Diary of a Country Priest, where like his meditations on our Lord are in the text. Like he actually has the prayers in the text in some places. So anyway, that's diverged from what you were talking about now that I think about it, but I just wanted to mention it. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That actually touches on something I wanted to mention as well. Those are some keen observations on how Rodriguez perhaps doesn't really seem like the kind of person he should be or that we would expect him to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think since you observed that, I think you will find uh, what I'm about to say illuminating, I hope.
Hmm.
So I found a little article at First Things that was written around the time that Scorsese's film adaptation was coming out.
Okay.
And the author of this article, said some interesting things about the book specifically.
This might have been the
And
same
there are a
article I
couple.
read. Who wrote the article? Do you remember?
The name of the author is Roy Peachy.
It's a name.
It's Peachy with an E
Yeah, yeah.
before the Y. So there are a couple paragraphs that I think will illuminate our discussion here and what you were just talking about in particular. Here's what he says.
Sure.
What is most striking about Silence, when one rereads it today, is the extent to which it is a novel of its time. Rodriguez, in particular, is plagued by a very modern form of doubt. Almost immediately after his arrival in Japan and before his own arrest, he urges Japanese Catholics to trample on the fumie and is scathing about the promise of paradise. Tormented by the silence of God, he has a surprisingly secular understanding of the world. Given the nature of his mission and the era in which the book is set, the mid 17th century, this understanding seems historically implausible.
Hmm.
But as both Martin Scorsese, in his introduction to the most recent edition of the novel, and Francis Matthey, in his introduction to The Golden Country, a sort of theatrical prequel to the novel, point out, Endo was motivated not primarily by a desire for historical veracity, but by his own contemporary concerns.
Hmm. Ah.
Um, let's see, I'll read a little bit of the paragraph that follows. Since the Odyssey springs from a very modern understanding of the relationship between God and man, it makes sense to see Silence not so much as an authentically historical novel, but rather as an existential or even political one, with Orwell's Winston Smith being Rodriguez's most significant literary antecedent. The Portuguese priest may not come to love his equivalent of Big Brother, but after interrogation and the threat of torture, he does submit to the intransigent political power of his day and willingly serves it. Now, I wanted to read all that because I think it pertains very much to what you were saying, that
Hmm.
something seems off about Rodriguez. And the author of this article is basically saying, yeah, there's something off about Rodriguez. He's not really meant to be an accurate portrayal of his time period at all. He's just basically like a stand in for modern concerns and
Well,
ways of thinking.
I think that's half true. I mean, you know, this is getting into a slightly uh, deeper conversation about what literature actually is, and obviously, literature. This is a novel written by an intelligent, rather very intelligent writer who's deliberately choosing to put certain things in his novel and tell his story a certain way, even if it may be deliberate, it may not be totally conscious at times of how things end up in a creative work of art here. But as a result of that, like he's always going to be using the setting, using the characters in order to basically say something, and that doesn't. People hear that and often jump straight to like, well, that's basically saying all novels are allegorical, and that's not really what I mean. It's he's trying to express something about, in this case, the faith, or at least the faith with relation to Japan, with him to relation to himself, and with relation also to the world at large, all at once in this book. And it's a lot of that's actually pretty plainly stated in the book. It's just you have, on one hand, this idea of a universal church that's meeting Japan, in which it doesn't seem like it can function, so therefore it can't be universal. So how does it work in other places? Like that stuff is pretty plainly stated, and then put that into context with Rodriguez's own character. Um, yeah, I do think there's, in this case, I do think there's quite a bit of intentional allegory going on. And I was actually looking at, before we started recording tonight, I wanted to double check when the book was published, which was in '66. So right after the Second Vatican Council, but as I understand it, I didn't live through that period, obviously. As I understand it, it was before the reforms really went off the rails and people started actually seriously questioning what's going on with the church during the 70s. So I don't think. Uh, Part of me does wonder if Rodriguez is to some extent an allegory of the modernizing efforts of the church that had been going on right before the council and through the council and afterwards, and this sort of inappropriateness of a almost like a demystification uh, of of the church during that period. But that I don't really know, just because, for one thing, the church in Japan after World War II is itself a very fascinating topic that I know next to nothing about. And two, just because it's so close to the council that I like that ball didn't really get rolling into all of its chaos until well into like 68, 69, 70, 74, and that kind of thing. So, yeah. I just certainly agree with the writer's position that Rodriguez is weird, but yeah, I think just chalking it up to, like, does he have an explanation, or does he offer an explanation up beyond just, Endo just did this arbitrarily? He just inserted a modern character into a historical narrative. Does he offer any suspicion as to why he would do that?
I'm skimming through the rest of it again to see what, if anything, he has to say about that.
I'll make sure to put a link to this article in the show notes as well.
All right. I'm trying to skim and engage at the same time. It's not going too well,
Yeah,
but
basically,
I'm not sure I can point to much here in this article that addresses directly what anything Endo himself said or wrote directly that could answer that question.
Right.
But the author seems to speculate that there was some, well, regardless of what Endo intended or not, he points to some resonance with among left-wing Japanese readers, quote unquote, who saw in the struggles of the Jesuit missionaries something akin to the situation their Marxist predecessors had faced in the
Yeah.
1930s.
Yeah, I've seen that that allegation before too. I always think it's funny.
Well, at any rate, since we're talking about Endo a little bit now, it's probably worth mentioning. You've touched on it a bit already. Obviously, one of the other very prominent themes in this novel has to do with the compatibility of Christianity with Japan, and the particular edition of the novel that I read has some pretty charged has a pretty charged statement attributed to Endo that pertains to that question, and I didn't go looking for a source myself. I should make that clear, but
Sure.
Endo was quoted as saying that I'm trying to find it now. So this is the translator that I'm reading in this particular edition, and he quotes Endo as saying, "The Japanese must absorb Christianity without the support of a Christian tradition or history or legacy or sensibility." And I thought that sounded pretty insane, but you know, as I say, I didn't look it up. I didn't look for context, but that was thrown at me anyway in this particular edition that I was reading.
Yeah, he goes on, even this attempt is the occasion of much resistance and anguish and pain. Still, it is impossible to counter by closing one's eyes to the difficulties. No doubt this is the peculiar cross that God has given to the Japanese. Yeah, that's, I don't know where that came from, but yeah, I've got this, I must have the same edition you have.
Oh, I see. You've got it right in front of you.
Yeah, I've got the book right in front of me, yeah. And I remember reading that in the translator's introduction. Translator was William Johnston. I found his introduction to be kind of irrelevant to the book in large part. I didn't find his translation seemed fine. It was very well written. I assume it's very accurate, but I didn't find his introduction to be particularly noteworthy. But yeah, go ahead. That quote is pretty intense.
Well, I guess I was just mentioning that quotation from Endo, just because, uh, I don't really know all that much about Endo as a person at all, but
Hmm.
that just seems like a pretty strong thing to say. Perhaps deliberately hyperbolic. You wanna comment on it?
I don't know almost anything about Endo. I haven't read too much into his background or his biography. I have read this book, and I had years ago, after I first read this the first time, I had started reading The Samurai, but I didn't finish it. So I'd like to go back and read that, reread what I started. I know that he was Catholic. I know that he was very prolific. He wrote a ton, and he was very well respected in Japan as well as internationally for his books. He was supposed to, well, supposed to is a strong word. He was in the running for getting the 1992, I think, Nobel Prize in Literature, but that ended up going to Kenzaburo Oe instead. I haven't read any of his novels, but I'm not very inclined to. He wrote in a style that I'm not that interested in. He's also, from what I've read about his novels, some of them are rather politically charged, and it's kind of whatever. Maybe he's good. I mean, he won the prize, I guess, but he was also, Endo was also friends with uh, Kaga. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There was another rather famous Japanese writer of literature that, because of Endo, ended up converting to the faith, which is pretty cool. So he was all apparently, I mean, absolutely spectacular writer. That's all I can say.
Well, maybe there's not too much to be gained from trying to dive into the author's head too much, but I was just curious because uh, that that quote that I read is obviously related to this theme of the novel, which is that at least the way the Japanese authorities are presenting it, uh, your religion just doesn't belong here. It doesn't fit here. It never will. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak too much for Endo, but when I look at this, I don't know. I kind of see exactly what he's saying because, you know, maybe in the sense of Christianity without the support of a Christian tradition or history or legacy or sensibility. Now, in America, we do have those things, but also when you think of the historicity of the biblical narrative, you're looking at an alien location for everyone who's not, you know, in the Middle East, who's not, hanging around Jerusalem and Galilee in the Sea of Galilee and stuff. But then what the West also has is the growth of a entire civilization um, that was Christian. It was baptized and then further developed into an entire Christian civilization for some 2,000 years, until the Christian part ended up getting kind of uh, smothered a little bit in its old age home, and now we're living in what's left of it. Japan only ended up like interacting with that civilization and that tradition from the outside. It never really had it was never infused in the way that Europe was. Um, so I think that's kind of what his point is. It's you end up having to perhaps reconcile this sort of idea of what civilization is, uh, and with what Christianity is, in a way that the Westerner doesn't have to do the same kind of process. I don't think. Even Western converts, like I grew up without any particular religious background. I didn't grow up with any Protestant background. My parents are actually both fallen away Catholics still, unfortunately, but they didn't choose a different religion after they fell away. They just basically became more or less, suburban secular humanists, more or less. So, a lot of I haven't talked much about my conversion. I don't really plan to. It's not the space here. But that's my point, is that I kind of sympathize with what he's saying here a little bit. It's just in the West, the Christian institutions are everywhere here, even if they're not very good. They're still, you still see the imagery there. You still see the vestiges of the structures that used to be occupied by Christian thought and Christian methods here, whereas in Japan, that's all going to be Buddhist and Shinto. Um, I think that's what his point was. I don't think he's saying in that quote that it's impossible for the Japanese to convert. I think he's just saying that their view is going to be a little bit different, and I think that's also true.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask you about it, because you're reading it more, perhaps charitably than I did, and in a way that probably gels better with Endo's own faith, probably.
Yeah.
But just taking the words at face value, they just seemed rather stark and overpowering to me.
Yeah, that does sound like he's saying basically that like you can either be Christian or be Japanese, and you can't be both. But I don't think that's what he's saying. To some extent, I think actually that might be exactly what he's saying. But I think that's the same extent that's being said when you're really, I mean, that's almost asked of almost any Christian to some extent. It's not, there's subtlety involved, there's nuance involved, but like at the end of the day, it's like, you know, you should be Christian before you are the next thing in line, and you should still be that next thing in line, but you should remember what your priorities are. So, in the case of this, the Japanese authorities are demanding that the priority is the other way around. That that's the whole point of the Fumie. That's the whole point of the crackdown on the Christians in the book, is to ensure that the priorities are Japan first, religion second, you know, peasantry third, I guess. Peasantry somewhere actually is going to be way down at the bottom of the list there, but that's exactly what the book is about, I think. Intense, though.
Yeah. There's. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how neatly we can transition into this different topic, but I feel like the discussion would be missing something if we didn't talk about it at least a bit somehow,
Sure.
and that is uh, Kitajiro.
Yeah, he's so
You,
important in this book. He's really, really important.
I want to start by making the very elementary observation that uh, I really think he's meant to. Uh, I want to say that he represents the average Christian, or
Good.
to in a lot of ways, at least. I think many people might object to my characterization that way, because they would say you're nuts. He's absolutely despicable, and just spends the whole novel being a failure, which basically just makes me want to say, "What do you think you are?"
Right. Yeah. I think it is a. I think it is a little harsh to accuse all Christians of being just like Itajiro, but I see where you're coming from. I, I think one way, uh, this is slightly another side thing. Just it occurred to me thinking about when we were talking earlier about Rodriguez's character. Um, Kichijiro mentions at least twice. I think he mentions it almost every time he talks. Uh, that he had been a Christian. He had apostatized, and he had talked with Rodriguez about how he's just not strong. Other Christians, all these Christians that go to their death, to the martyrdom, they're strong, but I'm not strong. I can never be strong. That's just how I am. How could if only I had been born in a time where this strife didn't exist? And Rodriguez actually started to believe him, and just believed him after that, about that, like, and that's what played into Rodriguez's view of the rest of the Christians in Japan. It's like, if they had just been born at a time where these demands weren't placed upon them, where they didn't have to be subjected to this persecution, they could have lived out their fine, humble little lives in squalor and been good Christians, and that would be that. But instead, they're subjected to these trials and martyrdoms, and so many of them are apostatizing instead. And it's just like Kichijiro here. And that in the case of Rodriguez, that plays into his character because now he's pretty much rejecting any providential view of history and the notion that you're born at the time that you're supposed to be born. But in the case of Kichijiro himself, this is obviously something that he might believe it, but he's obviously just saying that as a cope because he feels unimaginable guilt over everything that he's both done and hasn't done when he should have done. As far as I do think he is to some extent a stand-in for the average Christian. I don't think that's really the reason why he's included. I got the impression, actually, on a more sort of metaphysical reading of it, I guess, that it's not really the right word, but it sounds cool. He's in many ways an expression of Rodriguez's guilty conscience, and almost like his everything about himself that he intentionally doesn't view and detests. Where it's like I'm this upstanding man of faith who will never apostatize and will be martyred first, and I'm stuck with the exact opposite, who is glued to me by providence, who just is, we're just stuck together. He's just like everything that Rodriguez isn't, which includes, funny enough, honesty. Even though he's a liar and a betrayer, he's still weirdly honest about his position, about who and what he is.
That's very true.
The fact that he's continuing, sorry to interrupt, but the fact that he continues to come back to Rodriguez to request absolution and confession, he does it at least twice, I think he does it 3 times, is a clear mark that he seems to have a better grasp of the faith than Rodriguez does. But at the same time, Rodriguez has no one to go to confession to go to confess to. I mean, there are dogmatically speaking, there are extenuating circumstances, but still, like, he doesn't have that same inclination that he needs. He doesn't. You never get the impression Rodriguez feels the need to say he has to confess something, or he feels guilt over something overwhelming that demands absolution in this way, the way that Kichijiro clearly does, explicitly does.
Yeah, I don't wish to overstate my case. If I meant to be saying anything, I suppose it was more just that I find Kichijiro perhaps more sympathetic than I ought to.
I agree, yeah. Especially this second reading through, I found him much more sympathetic than my first reading. I think that's, I think that's not just because I've read the book before. I think that really is because I converted. It's how the faith has informed my life and how I see the world now, and action and will and that kind of thing. It's like, oh, I get it. Yeah. Hello?
I'm sorry, I'm still here. I was just trying to remember. There was something else I was thinking of saying about Kichijiro, but it wasn't coming to mind.
I apologize. Apologies for rambling. See if I've got anything in my notes that I haven't already.
You keep us out of the dead air. It's okay.
Do my best. Let me see here. Yeah, I think I covered everything important that I wanted to cover. One of the things I did want to mention earlier on, I mentioned that Rodriguez's apostasy was the result of him contorting his view of the faith. And I noted this. I didn't write anything down on this note, which is a shame because I should have. He's a priest. He's gone through seminary. He's worked very closely with religious for his whole life, and he's clearly a younger guy. I mean, I don't think he's ever given an age, but I'm assuming he's like 25 at most. Maybe I don't think his birth year is ever mentioned. He's just a young man. So, but still, he's given all this education, all this religious education, and his theological education. But then, over the course of being subjected to the fire and the anvil, so to speak, his view of God as mentioned before, is very modern to some extent, to a large extent, and this results in him contorting. Oh, this is what I wanted to mention. Not quite. The contortion doesn't really happen in full until the end with the apostasy, where he's convinced that somehow God himself would commit apostasy to help human beings, which is such an insane thing to believe. It's it's a completely insane thing to believe, just because of what God is. But the other thing too is recognizing that throughout the whole book, this is another one of those things that, like, I've never heard priests talk like this before, is he's interiorly preoccupied, for the most part in a good way, with the face of Christ, and uses this as a tool for his meditation in prayer. At least it's what it seems to be. However, he's always referring to our Lord as a man, which isn't weird in and of itself. That kind of language comes up fairly common. In fact, the preconciliar writers, the apostolic fathers and stuff, you see that kind of language come up quite a bit in their writings too, depending on the context. But with this, when you're surrounded by the level of misery that's being dispensed on these Christians, and you're utterly powerless to do anything about it, again, I've never been in that situation, but it seems counterintuitive to me that you would be focusing specifically on the aspect of our Lord who was his human nature rather than his redemptive. I mean, I guess that was still part of the redemptive qualities, but I don't know. You'd be wanting a direct personal lifeline to his ear, and I don't think you would be meditating on his humanness in order to do that necessarily. But I know everybody's different, I guess. Maybe you could. It's kind of like, there's, despite being a priest in such a horrible situation, there's really like zero exhortations to Our Lady, zero exhortations to any of the saints, very little prayer life in general coming across. So yeah, that kind of speaks to what you mentioned before with the one guy talking about a modern character in a historical setting. But
Right. And I want to ask you, since you've been pointing out all these things, what this is pretty speculative. What do you think we are supposed to take away from the fact that this character is like this?
yeah, that's what did Endo mean by this? You mean? That's the
Yeah, I'm
question.
afraid that's what I mean.
That's the question.
I don't really know.
Yeah. So if I was going to posit something about the whole book in general, I started to mention this earlier, and I just don't completely know, but I do suspect that this character, if you read the book as an allegory on some level, I do think that Rodriguez is what Endo either sees in the church at that point modern day Japan, or fears the church could be in that point in modern day Japan, and or fears that this is something the church could turn into, or is already acting, or like some of the prelates may already be acting in such a way where they're just not getting it. They're just like they're interfacing with Japan the wrong way, and their own faith is even confused, and which is leading to the faith that is actually alive there, because accusations of Japan being a swamp are always coming from people who have a vested interest in not letting Christianity take root in Japan. Meanwhile, you're still seeing Japanese Christians, entire settlements of them. They're emptying out, but there's still entire settlements of them. And every time you get a view of their faith in the story, their faith might be simple, but it's still, by all outward appearances, the same faith as the faith of Rome. It's the same faith of the people that are practicing Christians anywhere else in the world. So, why would you make this priest who's come here in order to investigate the apostasy of his mentor like this? I think that is a cautionary tale, because clearly Endo is not saying be like Rodriguez. I think it's very much I think he's using this character in order to if not in the case of allegory and fears of what the church is doing, on a more personal level, I think he's also using this character to peel open, use a cliche, I guess, the inner workings of what faith's interaction with what the object of faith is, I guess, how the intellect can understand it and how the will should be operating with it and interacting with it, and right and wrong answers. Mostly in this book, showing many wrong answers by example. Presumptions of what the faith are rather than what the faith actually is. That kind of thing, because obviously, the book ends with him apostatizing. Even if it's only in an outward form, his experiences in Japan haven't completely. I mentioned before that the contortion of his faith happens at the end. My suspicion is, after talking through it again like this and having read the book again, is actually that his faith was already contorted before he even got to Japan, and it was that these experiences forced him to come to terms with that and make a decision as to whether he would continue with that contortion or rectify it, basically. And the reason I think this is because of that common theme that we just mentioned earlier about, if only these peasants hadn't been born in this period in time, they would not have to be subjected to these tests of faith, and therefore they could have lived out their lives as better Christians as a result, which, you read any account of saints under persecution, and their judgment is the exact opposite. It is by that trial by fire that the faith is turned into a diamond, or is made better, is made more complete and more full. So, trying experiences are obviously tests that will galvanize somebody. That's the whole point. They galvanize a personality, and that galvanization sometimes comes with a choice. And in this case, the choice was a failure. He failed the test. But he still lived out the rest of his life, so there's still an option for redemption of some kind. And it's ambiguous as to whether he was redeemed. I don't think he was by the end of it.
It's between him and his silent god.
Yeah. I think Kichijiro could have been, but I still find it very amusing that Kichijiro is just leaves the narrative as mysteriously as he enters it, and also very much with his head bowed, slinking out the door, trying to get out of the way. But yeah, that's what I think that's why I think Endo chose this character for this purpose, because I don't think you could have explored the same idea of what. How faith is expressed and how the inner workings of one's interior life operates with the faith the same way if you were doing it with like the priest from Diary of a Country Priest, right? Like, I just don't think you could really, someone who's much more upstanding, I don't think you'd be able to get at those things quite as well. Maybe you could, but I just don't think, because there's a lot of conflict and tension involved, and interior conflict and tension involved in order to bring that to light in a narrative, and psychologically in order to get that get the awareness to focus on these things. But if someone is if someone has these questions already answered, then they're not even going to be thinking about them. The key example being Garp, who the other priest who gets martyred early on, going out to save the Christians. Like, they don't subject him to the kind of interrogations they subjected Rodriguez to, because he's clearly not even going to pay them any mind. Or the priest that finally arrives on the island, on the archipelago, a few weeks later, all rested up and ready to go, and they encounter him and just immediately kill him, because the interrogation techniques aren't going to work on him. So,
speaking of questions we wouldn't even be asking ourselves, we should wrap it up, I'm sure, but we somehow got into this entire conversation without really talking about the title of the novel and one of the other pervasive themes, the silence of God, alleged.
Yeah, funny that. Yeah. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, I mean, trying to tie it into what we were already talking about feels a bit difficult at this point.
Yeah.
But I just thought I should at least acknowledge that somehow we managed not to do that.
It doesn't seem to me that God's
What do you think?
particularly silent in this book. I mean, it just doesn't seem like he's all that silent. As the priest is trying to make God speak, uh, like one specific particular kind of language is the only thing he wants to listen.
Yeah, he wants an audible voice in his ear.
Something like that, or he just wants he wants what he thinks should be done to be inflicted on the world around him. And that's
Oh, yes. I meant to say, if we were going to talk about this at all, when he finally thinks that he does hear God speaking, it's to tell him he should apostatize.
exactly, yeah, exactly. Um, and versus kind of touched on this earlier with the Rodriguez's complete absence of a providential belief that God's will is active and unfolding in history at every given time, every given moment. So there's no way somebody could have been born at the wrong time. The that's a theme that is very. It, One might argue I'm bringing that into the book myself, but that's basically saying I'm bringing Catholicism into a book about Catholicism. I don't think that's fair. I think it's in the book insofar as this is how Christians view the world. This is just how we reason through it. So I think that's fine. So the silence is I think the silence is Rodriguez has earplugs in.
Yeah. Did you try opening your pocket Bible, Rodriguez?
Yeah.
Did you bring one with you with your rosary?
To be fair, it may have gotten waterlogged.
Yeah.
Still, though, I mean, he's a priest. He's gonna have certain passages memorized. Like, anyway, yeah. So, yeah, we should probably wrap it up. Land the plane here. Any other thoughts on silence?
I don't think so. I spent it all in a disorganized fashion, but I hope there was some insight somewhere in there.
I hope so too. I rambled and wore my voice out, so I'm going to let my voice rest. Cool. All right. Well, that brings it to the end, and hopefully we can schedule another bookcast to be earlier than just 2 months or 3 months from now. We'll have to decide on a book and then go from there. But until then, um, that's it from me. So I'll let you give the final parting words here.
I hope you all found the wait was worth it. I enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. All right. And that's it.